The phone call came on a Thursday evening in February. I was in my kitchen in Atlanta, making dinner for one, something I had gotten used to over the previous 3 months as my weekends disappeared into the 4-hour drive to Savannah and back. The number on my screen was one I did not recognize. I almost let it go. I answered because something made me. The same instinct that makes you turn around in a parking lot when you cannot explain why. The voice on the other end was calm and measured and careful in the way of someone who has thought hard about what they are about to say. "My name is Gloria Reeves," she said. "I am your father's private nurse. I have been with him every day for the past 6 weeks. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully before you react." I turned off the stove. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I listened. What Gloria told me in the next 12 minutes was something I had not been prepared for. Not the grief. I had been preparing for grief for months. Grief, I understood. Grief I had been carrying in my chest since the diagnosis, like a stone I had learned to walk with. What I had not prepared for was betrayal. Not from a stranger. Not from someone I barely knew. From the man I had been married to for 14 years. Before I tell you what Gloria had been writing in that notebook by my father's bedside, and what we did with what she had written, I want to ask you something. Have you ever received a phone call that split your life cleanly into before and after? Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are listening from today. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe. Because this story is just beginning. Before I take you back to where this began, let me tell you who I was. My name is Diane Calloway, 43 years old, Associate Dean of Student Affairs at a private university in Atlanta, Georgia. 18 years in higher education. The kind of work that requires you to hold other people's difficult moments with steadiness and care, to be the person in the room who does not panic when everything else is falling apart. I was good at that. I had learned it young. My father had taught me. James Calloway was 74 years old and had been one of Savannah's most respected estate attorneys for 40 years before he retired. He had spent his entire career helping families protect what they had built. He understood better than almost anyone what happened when families did not plan carefully. What happened when the wrong people got access to the wrong documents at the wrong time. He had planned carefully. He had a will, updated 3 years before his diagnosis. Everything left to me, his only child. The house on Gaston Street where I had grown up. The investment accounts he had built over 40 years of careful work. A total estate value of approximately $890,000. He had told me about it directly, clearly, the way he did everything. "This is what I have built," he said. "This is what is yours when I am gone. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." I had not understood then why he said that last part. I understand it now. This is my story. I met Richard Calloway. He took my name when we married, something I had loved him for, at a faculty dinner in the fall of 2005. He taught architectural history at Georgia Tech, quiet and intellectual and precise in the way of someone who had spent years thinking carefully about how things were built. He asked me questions at that dinner that nobody else had thought to ask. He wanted to know what I found most difficult about my work. He wanted to know what I was reading. He wanted to know what I thought about things that mattered. I married him 2 years later. Our wedding was in Savannah. Of course it was in Savannah, in my father's garden on Gaston Street in the spring. 30 guests. Wisteria blooming along the back fence. My father walked me down the garden path in his good suit and squeezed my hand at the end and whispered, "He is a good man, Diane." I believe that. I thought about that whisper a great deal in the months that followed Gloria's phone call. My father had believed it once. So had I. The early years were genuinely good. Richard was present and attentive and the kind of partner who remembered small things, the particular tea I liked, the author I was reading, the way I needed 20 minutes of quiet when I came home before I could talk about the day. He built a life around my rhythms without making it obvious that he was doing it. I loved him for the quality of his attention. I did not yet understand that attention can be a strategy as much as a gift. My father was diagnosed in the fall of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The oncologist was honest in the way that good doctors are, direct about the prognosis, careful about false hope, clear about what the coming months would look like. 6 months. Perhaps 8 with treatment. Perhaps less. I drove to Savannah that weekend and sat with my father in his kitchen, the kitchen where he had made my breakfast every morning for 18 years, where the coffee maker was always on by 6 and the newspaper was always folded to the crossword, and we talked for a very long time. He was not afraid. That was the thing about my father. He had spent 40 years helping people prepare for death, and he had prepared himself with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. "Everything is in order," he said. "You know where the documents are. Margaret at the firm has a copy of everything. You do not need to worry about any of that." I told him I was not worried about any of that. He looked at me over his coffee cup with the particular look he had, the one that meant he knew I was not telling the whole truth. We sat in that kitchen until the afternoon light shifted and the room went gold and quiet. I drove home that Sunday with a stone in my chest heavier than it had been before. Richard was sympathetic in the beginning. He came with me to Savannah twice in October. He sat with my father in the living room and talked about architecture and Savannah's historic preservation districts, a subject my father had opinions about, and I watched them together and felt grateful that Richard could give my father something normal to hold on to. He stopped coming in November. "Work commitments," he said. "A research deadline. A departmental review." I did not press him. I was exhausted and grief had narrowed my attention to the essential, getting to Savannah, sitting with my father, getting back, getting through the week, getting back to Savannah again. I did not notice the change in Richard because I had very little attention left for noticing. That was what he had been counting on. I understand that now. Gloria Reeves had been a private duty nurse for 22 years. She had sat with a great many families through a great many endings. She had seen grief in all its forms, the honest kind, the complicated kind, the kind that wore other faces. She had been hired to care for my father 6 weeks before she called me. She arrived every morning at 7 and stayed until 7 in the evening. She managed his medications, monitored his comfort, kept the house running quietly around him so that his remaining energy could go toward being present rather than managing logistics. She was observant in the way that good nurses are, not intrusively, not voyeuristically, but with a steady attentiveness of someone whose job requires knowing everything that is happening in a room. She had a small notebook. She wrote things down. Not everything. Not personal conversations or private moments between my father and me, but anything that seemed, in her professional judgment, worth recording. The first entry that concerned her was from a Tuesday in January. A phone call my father received in the afternoon while she was in the next room preparing his medication. She did not hear the full conversation. She heard enough. She heard my father's voice go flat in a way it did not normally go flat. She heard him say, "I do not think that is appropriate, Richard." And then after pause, "That is not something I am willing to discuss." She wrote it down. Date, time, approximate content. She did not call me yet. She waited. The second entry was from the following week. A visitor to the house, while I was in Atlanta. A man she did not recognize. Well-dressed. Carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself to my father as a colleague of Margaret's, Margaret being my father's longtime estate attorney. My father did not appear to have expected him. Their conversation lasted 20 minutes in the study, with the door closed. Gloria noted the time he arrived, the time he left, the name he had given, which she wrote down carefully in her notebook. The leather portfolio he carried in and carried out. After the man left, my father sat very still in his chair for a long time. Gloria brought him tea. He looked at her and said, "Gloria, if anything unusual happens, I need you to tell Diane." She said, "I already am, Mr. Calloway." He nodded once. He closed his eyes. She went back to her notebook. The third entry was what made her call me. She had looked up the name the visitor had given. He was not a colleague of Margaret's. He was an estate attorney, but from a different firm entirely. A firm that specialized in will modifications and estate restructuring. She sat with that information for one day. Then she called me on a Thursday evening in February. I called Margaret the next morning. Margaret Chen had been my father's attorney for 30 years. She had drawn up his will. She knew every detail of his estate. I told her what Gloria had told me. There was a silence on the line. Then Margaret said, "Diane, I received a call 3 weeks ago. From Richard. He said your father wanted to discuss updating his estate documents. He said your father was having second thoughts about the distribution and wanted to explore options. I sat very still. What did you tell him? I said. I told him that any changes to your father's will would need to come directly from your father, in person, with full capacity confirmed. I told him I would not discuss the contents of the estate with anyone other than your father directly. Did he call again? I asked. Once, she said. I did not take the call. I thanked her. I hung up. And I sat at my kitchen table, the one I had bought at a market in the Virginia Highland neighborhood the year Richard and I moved in together, the one with the scratch on the left corner from the time we moved it ourselves rather than hiring movers, the one where we had eaten 1,000 dinners, and I let myself feel it. Not the legal implications, not the next steps, not what I needed to do, just the feeling of understanding something that changes the shape of everything you thought you knew. I had been driving to Savannah every weekend for 4 months to sit with my dying father. And my husband had been using my absence to try to redirect my inheritance. I sat there for a long time. Then I called an attorney. Before I tell you what that attorney found when she started examining what Richard had actually done, and what my father said when I told him, I want to pause here. Have you ever had to process a betrayal quietly, in the middle of a grief that was already almost more than you could carry? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do, because what came next was something Richard had not anticipated at all. The attorney I retained was a woman named Patricia Holloway, estate litigation and family law. Her office was in Midtown Atlanta, and she had the particular composure of someone who had spent years untangling exactly this kind of situation. I brought her Gloria's notebook, a copy of the entries relevant to Richard's actions, Margaret's account of the phone calls, and a document Gloria had photographed discreetly, the business card the visitor had left on my father's side table after their meeting. Patricia examined everything carefully. Then she explained the legal landscape clearly. What Richard had attempted, she said, fell under a legal concept called undue influence. When someone attempts to manipulate a testator, the person making the will, particularly when that testator is elderly, ill, or vulnerable, and particularly when the manipulation is conducted without the testator's family's knowledge, the courts take it extremely seriously. The fact that he had contacted an outside estate attorney rather than working through Margaret, my father's own attorney of 30 years, suggested he knew that what he was attempting would not survive legitimate scrutiny. What do? I asked. We document everything, she said. We file a protective order with the probate court placing a formal watch on your father's estate documents, meaning any attempted modification triggers an immediate court review. And we begin building a case for undue influence that will hold up if Richard attempts anything further. She looked at me steadily. And then you tell your father. I drove to Savannah that Saturday. My father was having a better day than most. He was sitting up. The morning light was coming through the windows the way it always had in that house, long and golden and warm in the particular way of winter light in coastal Georgia. I sat beside him, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, I wondered when you would find out. I did not want to tell you. You had enough to carry. He had known. He had known about the calls, about the visitor, about what Richard was attempting. He had handled it the only way he knew how, by telling Gloria to watch, by refusing to cooperate, by trusting that his daughter would find out in time. He had raised me to be the kind of person who found out in time. I took his hand. We sat together in the winter light for a long time without saying anything. Some things do not need words. Patricia filed the protective order with the Chatham County Probate Court the following Monday. The order was granted within 48 hours. Any attempted modification to James Calloway's estate documents would now trigger immediate court review and notification to both Patricia and Margaret. Richard was informed of the order through his own attorney, whom he had apparently already retained, which told its own story. The following week, his attorney's response was to deny that Richard had intended any wrongdoing. He had simply been trying to help facilitate communication between my father and his estate attorney, the response said. He had been concerned about my father's wishes being fully understood. Patricia's response was 18 pages long. It included Gloria's notebook entries. Margaret's account of the phone calls. The business card. A detailed timeline of Richard's movements during the periods I had been in Savannah, and a formal request for full financial disclosure of Richard's accounts for the previous 24 months, because Patricia had noted, in her preliminary review, some irregularities in our joint finances that suggested the inheritance attempt had not been Richard's only financial strategy. She had been right to look. The forensic accountant Patricia retained was a woman named Carol Simmons. What Carol found in Richard's financial records over 6 weeks of examination told a story that ran alongside the inheritance attempt like a parallel track. Richard had opened a personal savings account 18 months earlier. Into it he had been making regular transfers, small ones, carefully timed, from our joint household account. Over 18 months the transfers totaled $34,000. He had also taken a personal loan against his university retirement account, $45,000, without telling me. The loan had been used to fund what his bank records described as investment activities. Carol traced those activities to a private real estate venture that had lost most of the money within a year. He had been building a financial exit for himself. The inheritance, $890,000, would have been the final piece. The piece that made everything else manageable. When I understood the full picture, I sat in Patricia's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and I thought about my father's kitchen. The coffee always on by 6. The crossword. The wisteria in the garden. The way he had squeezed my hand and said, "He is a good man, Diane." And I thought about how completely wrong we had both been. And then I stopped thinking about that. And I told Patricia to file for divorce. My father passed away in April. He died at home, in his own bed, in the room where he had slept for 40 years, with the Savannah morning light coming through the curtains and Gloria sitting quietly in the corner, and my hand in his. He knew the estate was protected. Patricia had made sure of that. The will stood exactly as he had written it 3 years before his diagnosis. Not a single word changed. Everything to me, exactly as he had intended. He died knowing that. I believe it gave him peace. The divorce proceedings ran for 7 months. Richard's attorney argued that his financial actions had been motivated by concern for our joint future and that the retirement loan and personal account were within his rights as an individual. Patricia's response addressed each point methodically and without emotion. The court found that the transfers from our joint account constituted dissipation of marital assets. The retirement loan, taken without my knowledge against an account that formed part of our marital estate, was treated as a marital liability to be assigned entirely to Richard in the division. The attempted will interference, while not resulting in criminal charges due to insufficient evidence of completed fraud, was entered into the record as evidence of Richard's intent and was considered by the court in assessing the overall equitable distribution. I received the majority of our marital assets. Richard received significantly less than he had planned for. He also did not receive a single dollar of my father's estate. I kept my father's house on Gaston Street. I had not planned to. I had thought it might be too heavy to hold, too full of everything I had lost that year. Too much grief in every room. But when I walked through it in June after the estate was settled and the paperwork was done, I found something different. The coffee maker still on the counter. The crossword books stacked by his chair. The garden where the wisteria came back every spring without being asked. I stood in his kitchen in the morning light, and I felt him there, not in a way that hurt, in a way that held. I decided to keep it. Gloria came to help me go through his things that summer. We worked through the house slowly over 2 weekends, careful, unhurried, the way you do when you want to honor what something meant. On the last afternoon, she handed me his notebook. Not her notebook, his. A small leather one he had kept on his nightstand. I opened it to the last entry. His handwriting, shakier than it used to be, but still precise, still his. He had written one line. "She will be fine. She always finds out in time." I closed the notebook. I put it in my bag. I carried it home. I want to ask you something before we close today. Have you ever lost someone and found, in the middle of that loss, that what they left behind was so much more than you expected? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if my story stayed with you today, if something in it gave you something you needed, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. My father spent 40 years helping families protect what they had built. In the end, he protected me. Not with documents. Not with legal strategies. With a nurse who had a notebook and 30 years of knowing when something was wrong. And with a daughter he had raised to find out in time. Thank you for being here. One more story is coming. One more woman who refused to stay silent. Do not miss her.